The War Council of the Vreth Dominion had not laughed in a very long time, but on this particular night, every single one of them was laughing. The great chamber was massive and cold, carved from black stone that had stood for 3,000 years. And at its long obsidian table sat the most powerful beings in the known galaxy: Grand Marshals, Fleet Commanders, Intelligence Directors, and at the head of them all, Supreme Counselor Dran, whose 4 eyes gleamed like hot coals in the low light. On the wall in front of them, a holographic display showed a small blue-green planet orbiting an average yellow star at the far edge of a quiet spiral arm of the galaxy. A planet so unremarkable that the Dominion's mapping drones had almost skipped past it entirely. The planet was called Earth, and the species that lived on it was called humanity. Grand Intelligence Director Vakith stood at the front of the room and read the report in a flat, bored voice. Because that is exactly how he felt about it. Bored. Species designation human, he read aloud. Homeworld, Earth. Sol system. A single star system with no colonies beyond their own moon, and a small surface settlement on their 4th planet. Lifespan, approximately 80 of their years. Physical profile, bipedal, no natural armor, no regenerative capability, no venom glands, no enhanced physical strength, no resistance to vacuum or radiation. Technological level, early spacefaring, chemical propellant projectile weapons, basic nuclear warheads, no energy weapons, no shielding technology, no FTL capability. He paused there and looked up at the council. They have not yet achieved faster-than-light travel, he said. They do not even know we exist. That was when the laughter started. It rolled around the great chamber like thunder, deep, rumbling laughter from beings who had crushed 400 civilizations across 3,000 years. Broken species, far stronger and far smarter than these small, soft, short-lived creatures on their little blue world. Grand Marshal Vekhar did not laugh. He smiled, which for him was something far more dangerous. Vekhar was the greatest military commander in the history of the Vreth Dominion, a 7-foot-tall warrior whose gray hide was crossed with old battle scars, who had personally led campaigns against 17 different species, and who had never, not once, in 300 years of warfare, lost a single campaign. He leaned forward in his chair and studied the image of Earth on the display wall, his black eyes moving slowly over its blue oceans and green land masses and white cloud cover. I will take them myself, he said. The laughter died down, and the chamber went quiet, because when Vekhar spoke in that tone, everyone listened. You want to lead the subjugation personally? Supreme Counselor Dran asked, his voice carrying a note of mild surprise. For this? For one primitive planet. I am not busy, Vekhar said simply, and I want the practice. More laughter, but quieter this time, and with a different edge to it, the edge of beings who knew that Vekhar did not make jokes. He was cleared to begin preparations immediately, and he spent the next 3 days selecting his force with great care, not because he thought he would need much, but because he believed that even small operations deserved proper soldiers. He chose the Vethkari. The Vethkari were the Dominion's elite warrior caste, 10,000 of the finest fighters ever bred and trained in the Empire's long history, beings who could survive brief exposure to open vacuum, who could regenerate a severed limb within a single day, who could lift 10 times the weight of a fully grown human, and who had fought and won on more than 200 different worlds across every environment imaginable. They had never lost. Not one campaign, not one major engagement, not one world they had set out to take. They were, by every measure the Dominion possessed, the most dangerous soldiers in the known galaxy. Vekhar looked at his 10,000 warriors and felt something close to pity for the small blue planet waiting for them at the edge of the galaxy. He had one order from the Council: bring back a live human for the Imperial Zoo. Just one. Alive. That was all they asked. While Vekar was preparing his fleet and loading his warriors into their dropships, a junior intelligence analyst named Sora was sitting alone in a small office 2 levels below the main council chamber, rereading the human data file for the 4th time. Sora was young by Dominion standards, barely 60 years old, barely past her training, and she had only recently been assigned to the Outer Rim Intelligence Division, which was considered a dull posting because nothing important ever came from the Outer Rim. Was supposed to finalize the Earth file and mark it closed. But something kept pulling her back to it. It was not the weapons data. Those were laughable. She agreed with everyone on that. It was not the biology report. Humans were physically weak. That was obvious. It was something else entirely. Something buried in the linguistic analysis section of the file. A small note added by a translation drone that had spent 6 weeks processing human communication signals. The note said, "No direct translation equivalent found in any of the 400 cataloged species languages for the following human concept: morale." Sora read the definition the drone had attempted to construct. An internal emotional condition shared collectively among a group of humans engaged in a difficult or dangerous task. Appears to influence combat performance, endurance, decision-making, and willingness to continue fighting beyond the point of logical survival. Unknown. Appears to be strengthened, not weakened, by loss and hardship. She sat back in her chair and read that last line again. Strengthened, not weakened, by loss and hardship. Every species the Dominion had ever cataloged broke under sustained pressure. It was a universal constant. It was the very foundation of the Dominion's military strategy. Apply enough force, cause enough pain, and any living thing will stop fighting and choose survival instead. Every species bent to that rule. She printed the note and walked up to the main briefing room, where her direct supervisor, Senior Director Morvan, was reviewing fleet deployment logistics with 2 of Vekar's staff officers. "Excuse me," she said. "I found something in the human file I think should be looked at before the fleet departs." Morvan glanced at her with the flat, heavy patience of someone who had been interrupted at a bad time. "What is it?" he asked. "A concept in their language," she said, holding out the printed note, "that our translation systems cannot match to anything in our database. It describes a kind of group strength that grows when things get worse for them. I think we should understand it before we send soldiers down there." Morvan took the note, read it once, and handed it back to her. "They are one planet," he said, "with chemical propellant weapons and no space travel. Vekar is bringing 10,000 Vethkari. I don't think an untranslatable vocabulary word is going to be a problem." He turned back to the logistics display. Sora stood there for a moment, the note in her hand, staring at the fleet deployment map on the wall, all those red markers moving toward a small yellow star at the edge of everything. Then she folded the note and put it in her pocket and walked back to her office. She filed the Earth report as closed, as she had been told to do. But she kept the note, and for reasons she could not fully explain, she did not sleep well that night. The Vreth Dominion fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel beyond the orbit of Neptune, and for a moment, everything was quiet. 10,000 Vethkari warriors sat in their dropships, sealed in their dark armor, weapons charged, ready for a mission that their commanders had privately begun calling the easiest campaign in Dominion history. Grand Marshal Vekar stood on the bridge of his command ship and looked at the Sol system spread out on the navigation display. The yellow star at the center, the small rocky planets close to it, the gas giants further out, and there, small and blue and quiet, the 3rd planet. He gave the order to begin the approach. 6 minutes later, something unexpected happened. A low-frequency signal began pinging from a loose network of small devices scattered across the outer solar system. devices so basic that the Dominion's long-range scanners had logged them as debris. But they were not debris, buoys, and they had been watching the dark between the stars for years, waiting for exactly this kind of arrival. Humanity had been watching the sky. Not because they knew the Dominion was coming, they did not, but because they had always suspected that the universe was large and that something in it might one day come looking for them. And they had decided, a long time ago, that they would rather know about it 6 minutes early than not know at all. 6 minutes was not a long time. But humans had learned over centuries of warfare against each other that 6 minutes was enough. Within those 6 minutes, every military installation across the solar system went to full alert. On Earth, on the Moon, on the Mars colonies, and on the small research stations scattered through the asteroid belt. Soldiers were woken, weapons were checked, and commanders began making calls that they had rehearsed in simulations dozens of times, but never expected to actually happen. Make. Vekar watched the human response on his sensors and felt the first small flicker of something he had not expected. Not quite concern, but something adjacent to it. A kind of heightened attention. They reacted in 6 minutes, his communications officer said, sounding genuinely surprised. That is faster than most spacefaring species we have encountered. They are not a spacefaring species, Vekar said flatly. Dropships will proceed to Mars first. The colony there is small and isolated. It will be a clean first engagement. The dropships fell toward the red planet in tight formation, their heat shields burning orange as they cut through the thin Martian atmosphere. And Vekar watched from orbit and thought about how simple this would be. The Mars colony was home to approximately 40,000 humans who had spent their lives living on a planet that was actively hostile to them in almost every way. Thin air, lethal radiation, freezing temperatures, dust storms that could last for months. They lived underground, mostly, in tunnels and pressurized habitat domes that they had built and rebuilt and repaired constantly over 3 generations. These were not soft people. These were people who had grown up understanding that their environment could kill them without warning, and that the only answer to that was preparation, ingenuity, and the absolute refusal to panic. When the Vethkari landed outside the main colony dome and began cutting through the outer airlock, they expected to find frightened civilians running for cover. What they found instead was a militia that had already sealed every secondary entrance, disabled the lighting in the outer corridors, flooded certain tunnels with non-breathable gas mixtures, and positioned fighters at every junction with weapons that were, by Dominion standards, extremely primitive, but which were being used with a precision and patience that was not primitive at all. The Vethkari were larger, stronger, and faster than any human. One Vethkari warrior could physically lift 3 humans at once, and had armor that could take direct hits from the colonists' rifles without serious damage. But they were fighting in tight tunnels barely wide enough for 2 of them to walk side by side, against opponents who knew every turn and corner and vent shaft in the entire network. Opponents who had spent years maintaining and mapping every centimeter of those tunnels, because their lives had always depended on knowing exactly where everything was. The 1st Battalion hit a geothermal trap 40 minutes into the assault. A human engineer named Torres, 26 years old, born on Mars, had never been to Earth in her life, had spent 2 days before the attack, quietly rerouting the colony's geothermal power grid through a set of unused maintenance corridors on the eastern approach. And when the 1st Vethkari Battalion moved into that corridor, she triggered the release. The heat was not enough to melt the Vethkari armor, but it was enough to make the ground unstable, to fill the corridor with superheated steam that blinded sensors and disrupted communications. And in the confusion, the human militia hit them from 3 separate directions at once. The 1st Battalion was not wiped out immediately, but it was stopped, and it retreated. And 300 Vethkari warriors, who had never retreated from anything in their lives, found themselves falling back, from 40 humans with old rifles and a very good understanding of their own plumbing. Vekar received the report from orbit and was quiet for a long time. He reviewed the helmet camera footage from his fallen soldiers, watching what had happened in those corridors with careful, methodical attention. And he noticed something that lodged in his mind and refused to leave. In the footage, as the humans were fighting, in the chaos of heat and noise and smoke, they were talking to each other, not shouting orders, not screaming in fear, talking in short, calm sentences, sometimes even laughing, the way beings laugh when they are focused and alive and exactly where they expect it to be. One soldier, a young man whose left arm was visibly injured, was guiding two others through a junction point, pointing left and right, and when one of them said something Vekar's translation system could not fully catch, the injured soldier laughed and said something back. Vekar watched that footage 3 times. He had fought on more than 200 worlds. He had faced species that were physically superior to humans in almost every measurable way. He had watched them break under pressure, because that was what living things did when they were hurt and frightened and outnumbered. These humans were hurt and outnumbered, but they were not frightened. Or if they were frightened, not stopping them from doing anything. He pulled up the report on the engineer Torres. 26 years old, no formal military training, listed occupation as infrastructure maintenance, and he looked at the geothermal trap she had built in 2 days, with the equipment available to her in a colonial maintenance bay. Then he looked at his battle map, at the losses his 1st Battalion had taken, and he said one sentence to his second-in-command. "We are going to need to take this more seriously than I thought." His second-in-command said nothing for a moment, and then asked if they should call for the reserve battalions. Vekar said yes. He did not say it loudly, and he did not say it with any visible emotion, because he was a professional, and professionals did not show what they were feeling on the outside. But standing there on the bridge of his command ship, looking down at the red surface of Mars, where his finest warriors were being slowed-end, redirected and bled by a colony of 40,000 people who had never trained for war against an alien species, Vekar felt something shift very quietly inside him. He did not have a name for the feeling. He filed it away and turned back to his screens and got back to work. Below him on Mars, in the dark tunnels, Torres was already drawing up her next trap. Vekar made his decision on the 4th day of the Mars campaign while standing over a table covered in casualty reports. He had lost more soldiers on that red planet than he had lost in his last 3 campaigns combined, and every single one of those campaigns had been against species that possessed real weapons, real technology, real military infrastructure, not against a colony of tunnel-dwelling civilians with repurposed mining tools and a very good knowledge of their own underground corridors. Mars was not the mission. Mars was an obstacle, a small, stubborn, infuriating obstacle, and Vekar was tired of it. He made the call to commit the full Vethkari force directly to Earth. All 10,000 warriors, 3 separate landing zones, 3 continents at once, North America, Eastern Europe, and the South Pacific. Simultaneous landings designed to overwhelm any coordinated response and force the humans to split their attention and their resources across an entire planet at the same time. He was certain that Earth would be different from Mars. Mars was extreme. 40,000 people who had been hardened by a lifetime on a hostile planet. But Earth was the human homeworld, and it had billions of people on it. And those billions had spent centuries fighting each other over politics and borders and resources. And Vekar had read the intelligence reports on human history and knew that these people could barely agree on anything. They would not coordinate. They would not unify. They were too divided, too different, too self-interested. They would each try to protect their own territory, their own government, their own population, and the Vethkari would move through them one piece at a time. He believed this completely. He was completely wrong. The dropships hit 3 continents at 0400 Earth time, and within the first hour, something happened that not a single intelligence report had predicted, and that every model the Dominion had built for human behavior said was impossible. Every human nation on the planet began sharing information with every other human nation. Not allies, not friendly countries with existing partnerships. Every country, including ones that had been in active conflict with each other just weeks before. Nations that had been trading sanctions and threats and bitter political arguments right up until the moment the alien ships appeared in Earth's sky. Old enemies passed targeting data to each other without hesitation. Rival military powers coordinated their air cover over shared borders, as if they had been doing it for years. A nation that had not spoken diplomatically with its neighbor in over a decade sent its ammunition reserves across the border before dawn and asked nothing in return. Vekar watched it happen on his sensors from orbit and could not make sense of it. Not how humans worked. His intelligence models said that the first thing humans did under external pressure was turn on each other, because that was what their history showed. That was what every study of their civilization indicated. But his intelligence models had been built by analysts who had studied human behavior during human conflicts where humans were fighting each other. And what those analysts had failed to understand was that there was a fundamental difference between a fight among family members and a fight against a stranger at the door. The Vethkari landed in North America, expecting chaos, and found a coordinated defense system that had been assembled in hours. Human soldiers moving with discipline and purpose, cities that had already been partially evacuated in a way that left the streets clear for military movement, while hiding civilians in hardened underground shelters, and a communication network that was decentralized enough that cutting one node made almost no difference, because 20 other nodes immediately picked up the signal. They landed in Eastern Europe and found themselves walking into the aftermath of 200 years of continent-wide warfare. People who had been invaded and occupied and burned and rebuilt and invaded again, and who had therefore spent generations developing an almost instinctive understanding of how to fight on their own ground, in their own cities, street by street and building by building. They landed in the South Pacific and found naval warfare conducted by humans who understood the ocean the way the Martian colonists understood their tunnels, completely, deeply, personally, and who used it against the Vethkari in ways that the Dominion's warfare doctrine had no category for. But the thing that began to change the war, the thing that Vekar and his commanders had no preparation for, was what happened to the Vethkari soldiers themselves on the ground. Vethkari had fought on 200 worlds and had developed, over centuries of successful warfare, an absolute confidence in their own invincibility. It was not arrogance exactly. It was simply knowledge, the deep-settled knowledge that they were the strongest beings in any fight they entered, and that knowledge had always been correct. On Earth, it stopped being correct. A Vethkari warrior in the South American theater took 6 direct rifle hits in the chest, wounds that would have stopped almost any other species, and kept moving, only to be brought down from above by a human who had been waiting in a tree for 9 hours, and who fired exactly 1 shot when the time was right. In Eastern Europe, a squad of 12 Vethkari entered a building that had appeared empty on their scanners. The humans inside had coated themselves and their weapons in materials that scrambled the Dominion's standard sensor frequencies, something that had been developed in 3 days by a group of engineers working out of a university basement, and the squad did not come out. In North America, human soldiers who had been shot and visibly injured kept fighting, not out of desperation, not because they had no choice, but because they had made a decision somewhere in the deep part of themselves that they were going to keep going, regardless of what their bodies were telling them. And that decision seemed to be made not once, but again and again, every few minutes, a constant internal renewal of the choice to continue. The Vethkari began to lose something they had never lost before in 300 years of unbroken victory. They began to lose their certainty. And when certainty left, something else moved into the space it had occupied. Something slow and cold and deeply unfamiliar. Something that affected their reaction times, their decision-making, their willingness to advance into dark spaces and tight corridors and buildings that might be empty. And might not be. It was fear. The finest warriors in the known galaxy were becoming afraid of creatures that were, by every physical measurement, significantly weaker than them. And the fear was not irrational. It was entirely earned, and that made it worse. Vekar received the psychological status reports from his field commanders with a blank expression, reading the language they used to describe what their soldiers were experiencing. Words like hesitation and sensor uncertainty and suboptimal engagement performance. And he understood what those words meant because he was a soldier himself, and he knew the feeling they were trying to describe without naming directly. He sat in his command chair for a long time after reading those reports. Then he opened an encrypted channel to the Dominion War Council and sent them a transmission that no Vreth Grand Marshal had ever sent in 3,000 years of conquest. He told them he needed more soldiers. He told them the situation was developing in unexpected ways. He told them, choosing his words very carefully, that the humans did not appear to have a surrender instinct. The Council received the message in 12 hours. They did not respond immediately. On Earth below him, in every time zone, across every landmass, the lights in the human command centers stayed on all night. And in the morning, fresh soldiers rotated in to replace the ones who had been fighting through the dark. And the ones who had been fighting through the dark sat down and ate and slept, and then a few hours later got up and went back to the line. Vekar watched it and understood, with a cold clarity that settled in his chest like a stone, that he had made a serious mistake. He had not come to fight a military. He had come to fight a species. And that was a very different thing. The reinforcements from the Dominion never came. Vekar waited for a response from the War Council for 3 days, then a week, then 2 weeks, and the channel stayed silent. Eventually, one of his communications officers picked up fragmented signals from the Dominion's inner territories that explained why. Word had spread. Not slowly, not quietly. It had moved through the galaxy the way fire moves through dry grass, jumping from one species to the next, carried by traders and scouts and diplomatic contacts and the deep, ancient rumor networks that connected every civilization in the known galaxy, whether the Dominion liked it or not. The undefeatable Vethkari were losing. They were not losing to a great empire, not losing to a species with advanced weapons or superior technology or a military force that had been built over centuries. They were losing to one small planet at the edge of everything, a planet the Dominion had marked as a low priority, target, and sent one fleet to handle in what was supposed to be a matter of weeks. Every species the Vreth Dominion had ever conquered was watching, and some of them were beginning to remember things they had put away a long time ago, the feeling of resistance, the memory of what it had been like to fight back before the Dominion arrived and the fighting stopped being an option. The Council had its own problems now, and 10,000 soldiers on a primitive planet at the edge of the galaxy were not at the top of their list. Vekar was on his own. He processed this information with the steady, controlled discipline of a commander who had been in difficult situations before. And then he looked at his battle maps, and his casualty numbers, and his supply projections. And he made the calculations. He had started with 10,000 Vethkari warriors. After 3 months of fighting on Mars, and 4 months of fighting on Earth, he had fewer than 6,000. Left. Phrase-alay. The humans had not stopped. That was the thing that sat at the center of every calculation, the fact that could not be worked around. The humans had not stopped, and there was no sign that they were going to stop, and everything that Vekhar's military experience told him about how a campaign like this should unfold kept running into that fact and breaking against it. He had taken cities, and the humans had taken them back. He had destroyed supply lines, and the humans had built new ones. He had hit command centers, and the humans had moved their command structure into smaller, distributed units that had no single center to destroy. He had tried to cause enough pain to make them choose survival over resistance, because that was how war ended. That was how war had always ended in the Dominion's 3,000 years of conquest. You applied force until the calculation changed for the enemy, until the cost of fighting became higher than the cost of surrendering. The calculation never changed for the humans. Or rather, and this was the part that Vekhar spent long hours thinking about in the quiet of his command room. The calculation changed, but it changed in the wrong direction. The human direction. Which meant that the more damage the Vekhari inflicted, the harder and more coordinated the response became. As if pain was fuel for them, rather than a reason to stop. The war lasted 18 more months after the reinforcements failed to arrive. Not a single dramatic final battle, no great last stand, no moment where the tide turned all at once. Just slow, grinding, methodical work by a species that rotated its soldiers and rested them and fed them and sent them back over and over, while the Vekhari had no rotation and no rest and supplies that were running lower every week. And while they were fighting, the humans were also doing something else. They were learning. Captured Vekhari. Equipment was taken apart within days by human engineers who had never seen alien technology before, and who approached it with the focused, almost joyful intensity of people being handed the most interesting puzzle of their lives. Within 2 months, human forces were using modified versions of Dominion communication frequencies to listen to Vekhari battlefield coordination in real time. And within 4 months, they had reverse-engineered enough of the armor technology to begin building their own versions. They adapted faster than any species the Dominion had ever fought. They adapted faster than the Dominion had thought was possible. One by one, the Vekhari fell, not all in battle, not all at the front. Some to injury, some to the accumulated weight of months of fighting without rest against an opponent that never seemed to tire. Some to the slow erosion of that deep certainty that had always been their foundation, and that, once gone, left something hollow in its place. The last survivor was a warrior named Keth. Keth was 400 years old, which made him ancient by any standard, and he had fought on more worlds than he could clearly remember anymore, and he had survived things that should have killed him a dozen times, and he was alone now in a way that he had never been in 400 years of service, because everyone he had ever fought beside was gone. He was captured in the ruins of a coastal city in what the humans called the Pacific Northwest, where he had been fighting alone for 11 days after his last squad was lost in an ambush. He did not go down easily. It took a team of 12 human soldiers working in careful coordinated shifts over 6 hours to corner him and contain him. And they did it without killing him, which he did not understand at all, because he had killed 4 of them in the process. When they finally had him restrained and his weapons removed, he was injured in 3 places and exhausted in a way that went deeper than his body. He waited for what happened next. What happened next was that a human medic sat down beside him, opened a small kit, and began cleaning his wounds. Her name was Yenna, and she was 23 years old, and she had been a medic for 2 years. And she had seen more damage in those 2 years than most humans saw in a lifetime. And she worked on Kent's injuries with calm, efficient hands. And while she worked, she hummed softly to herself, a low, tuneless sound that she probably was not even aware she was making. Keth watched her with his black eyes, and could not make sense of what was happening. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, in Vreth, which she did not speak. She looked up at him and did not understand the words, but seemed to understand the question, and she said something in her language, and then went back to work. A translator device was brought over, and she repeated what she had said. Because you are not fighting anymore. Kef had no response to that. He lay still and let her work, and looked up at the sky, which was gray and overcast, and thought about 400 years of war, and about 10,000 warriors who were gone, and about the planet they had been sent to conquer, that had not been conquered, and had not even come close to being conquered. Far above him, somewhere past the clouds, the bridge of Vekhar's command ship had gone quiet. 12 humans in salvaged environment suits had drifted through vacuum for 9 hours to reach it. 9 hours, which was a very long time to spend in a suit, with limited air, hanging in the dark, between a planet and an orbital station, moving slowly and with great patience toward a target that did not know they were coming. Vekhar had been a soldier for 300 years, and had seen almost everything. He had not seen this coming. The command ship was boarded, and the Grand Marshal of the greatest military force in the known galaxy was taken by 12 humans in repurposed suits who were running on approximately 4 hours of sleep and field rations, and whatever it was that kept humans going past every point where stopping would have been the rational choice. The Dominion War Council received Vekhar's final transmission 3 days later. It contained his status and coordinates, and one sentence that the council read 4 times before anyone in the chamber spoke. I underestimated the word. None of them knew what he meant. But Sora, sitting alone in her small office 2 levels below the chamber, held her folded note and read it again, and understood completely. The Dominion did not send another fleet. This was not a decision that came easily or quickly. There were voices in the War Council who argued for a second campaign, a larger one, a more prepared one that took the humans seriously from the start. But those voices grew quieter over the following weeks, as the situation at home became harder to ignore. The 400 species the Vreth Dominion had conquered over 3,000 years had been watching what happened at Sol, and some of them were no longer behaving the way conquered species were supposed to behave. There were small acts of resistance in the outer territories, slow refusals to meet production quotas, groups meeting in rooms that were not supposed to have meetings in them. The Dominion had always ruled through the absolute certainty of its own military power, the belief held by every species under its control that resistance was not just difficult, but truly impossible. And that certainty had developed a crack, and the crack had a name, and the name was Earth. The War Council met for 11 days without reaching a decision. On the 12th day, Sora walked into the chamber and asked to speak. She had not been invited. She walked in anyway, because she had decided the night before that if she did not do this now, she would spend the rest of her life in that small office watching the universe move without her, and she found that she was no longer willing to do that. She stood at the front of the chamber and faced 12 of the most powerful beings in the galaxy and said she wanted to go to Earth. Not with a fleet, not with weapons, alone, on a diplomatic vessel, unarmed, broadcasting on all frequencies, and she wanted to try something that the Dominion had not tried in 3,000 years of expansion. She wanted to talk. The chamber was very quiet for a long time. Supreme Counselor Drawn looked at her with those 4 hot coal eyes, and said, "You understand they may kill you." "Yes," she said. "You understand we cannot protect you." "Yes, you understand that if they reject the approach, we have no secondary plan." Sora looked at him steadily, and said, "I think they will not reject it. I think that is not what they do." She was given the ship and the channel frequencies, and a translation suite that now included a much more complete understanding of the human language than the one that had existed when the campaign began, built from months of intercepted transmissions and captured communications, and the slow, careful work of analysts who had spent a year trying to understand how humans talk to each other under pressure. She flew to Earth alone. The journey took 11 days, and she spent most of them reading, not military files or strategic assessments, but human things, human writing, stories they told each other, messages they had sent back and forth during the war. Transcripts of human commanders talking to their soldiers, ordinary people talking to their families. A human soldier's handwritten journal found near a battlefield that had been translated and that she read 3 times, because it said things she did not have the framework to fully understand the first 2 times. She broadcast her approach on all frequencies from the moment she entered the Sol system, announcing in the human language that she was unarmed, that she was alone, that she was coming to talk and nothing else. And she held her breath for the entire approach, waiting to find out if that would be enough. It was enough. They let her land in an open field outside a human city on the eastern coast of North America, and she sat in her ship for 2 minutes after touchdown, looking out the viewport at the blue sky and the green grass and the crowd of people who had gathered at a respectful distance from the landing site, held back by a loose line of uniformed humans, who were keeping the space clear. Then she opened the hatch and walked out. She had expected officials, military commanders, government leaders, armed guards, the kind of formal reception that the Dominion used when receiving foreign envoys. The kind of meeting that was really just a display of power, arranged to look like a conversation. What she found instead was a crowd of ordinary people, thousands of them, of every kind, and they were not angry. Or if some of them were angry, they were keeping it quiet, and many of them were simply curious, watching her with the open, unguarded attention of beings who were seeing something genuinely new and wanted to understand it. A group of people near the front were holding food. They were holding food out to her, offering it, as if this was the natural and obvious thing to do when someone arrived, regardless of who that someone was, or where they had come from, or what their people had done. Sora stood in the grass in the open air of a planet she had helped send a fleet to conquer, and a human woman in the front of the crowd held out a piece of fruit and smiled, and Sora felt something happen in her chest that she could not name and could not stop. Her eyes filled with liquid, and she stood very still and did not understand what was happening to her body. A human diplomat came to her side, a middle-aged man with gray at his temples, who introduced himself quietly and offered her his arm, the way she had seen in human historical media, an old gesture, a steady and dignified thing, and he walked her toward the building where the talks would happen. "I am sorry," she said, in her still imperfect human language, meaning sorry for her composure, and also meaning something much larger than that. He nodded and said, "We know." The negotiations were unlike anything in the Dominion's diplomatic history. Humanity did not ask for reparations. Territorial concessions did not present a list of conditions for peace. They asked for a conversation, which was genuinely confusing to Sora at first, because she had come prepared for demands, and what she got instead was questions. They wanted to know why the Dominion expanded the way it did. They wanted to know what the Vreth people valued and feared and hoped for. They wanted to understand, and they wanted to be understood. And they treated these things as the actual business of the meeting, rather than as pleasantries before the real negotiation. On the 3rd day of talks, Sora found herself explaining the Dominion's history. 3,000 years of expansion, the logic of security through control, the belief that a species that did not conquer would eventually be conquered, and a human diplomat listened to all of it with complete attention, and then asked, very simply, "Has it made you feel safe?" Sora stopped. She sat with the question for a long moment. "No," she said finally, "I do not think it has." The human diplomat nodded, as if this was not a surprise to him, and they moved forward from there. The agreement that emerged from 10 days of talks was not a peace treaty in the traditional sense. It was more like an opening, a door left ajar, a commitment to continue talking and to involve other species in the conversation, including the 400 that the Dominion had conquered, and that humanity had already begun reaching out to, through channels the Dominion had not officially approved, but also had not stopped. Word of what happened in those talks spread as fast as the news of the war had spread, and from every corner of the galaxy, species that had been under Dominion control for generations sent cautious signals toward the small blue planet at the edge of everything. They did not ask for military alliance. They did not ask for weapons or strategies or advice on how to fight. They asked, simply, how had the humans done it? Not just the fighting, which they could study, but the other part. The part where a species that had spent its entire history in conflict with itself had turned outward and become something unified without losing what made each part of it different and alive. Humanity's answer was translated into 400 languages and broadcast on every open channel, and it was 3 words long. We help back. It was not a strategy, and it was not a slogan. It was a description, a simple statement of the thing that had happened between nations that hated each other when the ships appeared in the sky. The thing that happened in the field hospitals behind the lines. The thing that happened when a young medic sat beside a wounded enemy and cleaned his injuries because he was no longer fighting, and therefore she no longer saw a reason not to. The 3 words traveled across the galaxy and landed differently in every language they were spoken. Translated into, but the meaning traveled with them, and in some places it landed in soil that had been waiting a very long time for exactly that kind of seed. Keth was released from the field hospital on a morning when the sky was clear and blue, and the air smelled like rain that had just stopped. He was escorted to his ship by Yenna, who had been his medic for the 4 weeks of his recovery, and who walked beside him across the grass with her hands in her pockets and her face turned up toward the sunlight. At the ship's ramp, he stopped and turned to face her. He had spent 4 weeks trying to find the right question, and he still had not found it, but he asked anyway. "What are you?" he said through the translation device, meaning the humans, meaning the species, meaning all of it. She thought about it for a moment, squinting slightly into the light. "Stubborn," she said, "and terrible at giving up on people, even the ones who tried to kill." He looked at her for a moment, and then he nodded, once, and walked up the ramp into his ship. He did not fly back to the Dominion military. He flew to the small planet where his family lived, 3 systems from the Dominion capital, and he landed in the yard outside his house in the late afternoon, and his family came running out and stopped when they saw him, because they had been told he was dead. And for a moment, everyone just stood in the yard and looked at each other. And then his youngest daughter crossed the yard and held on to him with both arms and would not let go. Keth stood in the light of a different sun than the one he had fought under, and he did not know what to do next, and he found, slowly, quietly, and with great surprise, that this did not feel like defeat. It felt like something he did not have a word for yet. But he thought he might, eventually, learn the word. He thought the humans would probably teach it to him, if he asked.